Hi, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back to continue our survey summary of the Old Testament, and we're going to start at the latter part of Genesis and run into the early part of Exodus. So we'll be crossing both books, and because of the nature of Genesis, that so much of it is wrapped in legend and folklore and stuff that you really don't know how much of it is historically accurate. I'm going to skip a lot of the stuff in between and come to the Joseph story, because you can put the Joseph story in the historical context of what we know about the Middle East at the time. The Joseph story is one of the more intriguing ones. He is the youngest son of a large number of sons, and he's the favorite. It's an interesting repetition, because we've seen the younger sons being favored, which is very unusual throughout some early Genesis writings, that Abel was the favorite son to his older brother Cain. Joseph is the favorite son to all his older brothers. Jacob is the younger son, favored over Esau. King David was the youngest of many sons. He becomes favored. So it's a very interesting thing that you find not typical for primogeniture, the oldest son taking the prize, etc., of the family. So he's the younger son. He's very capable, and he tells his brothers about a dream he had where they were all sheets of hay wrapped up in grain, and they were all bowing down to him. That really is not the way you get your older brothers to like you, to tell them the future is going to bring you bowing down to me. So eventually they get tired of him and decide to kill him. He has the coat of many colors, the special coat that his father decided to kill him. And one of the other younger brothers, who's more favorable, talks him out of it and says, well, you really just pretend he's dead and sell him off into slavery. So they sell him to a group of traveling people coming through, and take his coat of many colors and dip it in goat's blood and tell the father he's dead. He gets taken off to Egypt, sold into slavery there, where he has an unusual course, but very dramatic. He's very handsome and very capable, and even though he's a slave, he rises to where he's running the household for the man who owns him, Potiphar, and he's being very successful in that role. He has a problem. Potiphar's wife is sexually attracted to him and keeps trying to seduce him, and he keeps saying no, 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 and runs away finally, and she grabs his tunic and says the other thing to her husband: he came and attacked me, and et cetera, et cetera. So the husband throws Joseph into jail, and it's an interesting quandary, but this is all how the Lord controls the sequence to set him up for success. Because in the jail at the time are two royal prisoners sent there by the Pharaoh, and they have dreams while they're in prison, and one of them, and Joseph interprets the dream. One of them, he says, you're going to get executed, which happened. The second one, who is the cupbearer to the Pharaoh, he says you're going to be restored to the Pharaoh, and he goes back to the Pharaoh shortly thereafter. And this is the key event in the plan here. If you're familiar with cupbearers in the history of the Middle East, it's a very trust-driven position. If you're one of these despotic rulers, people are always trying to do you in. They're always trying to kill you, to take over your power, whether it's your generals, which are a big threat, other prominent people, or your family members, your brother, your uncle, your sons. So the cupbearer has to be very trusted, because if you want to poison the king, his cupbearer is the logical person to do it. So it's a very trusted position. Even much later, Nehemiah was the cupbearer for the Persian monarch, which shows how trusted he was before he came back and helped reestablish Jerusalem. So it's a very trusted position. So he goes back to Pharaoh, the cupbearer does, and the Pharaoh has these pattern of unusual dreams. First, there are 7 very fat cattle rising out of the Nile, and they're followed up by 7 lean and gaunt, emaciated cattle, and the emaciated cattle eat up the healthy, fat-looking cattle, but don't get any less emaciated. They're still looking emaciated. And then the next dream is stalk of corn with 7 great things of grain on it, and then followed by another stalk with 7 essentially dead things of grain consumed by the wind, etc. And he doesn't know what this means. And he mentioned it to the cupbearer, who said, well, there's this guy in prison named Joseph, and he can interpret our dreams. So he calls for Joseph. It's interesting that they say they clean him up and shave him. Well, they make him presentable to go to the monarch. And he tells Joseph the dreams, and Joseph said, you're going to have 7 years of great harvest, and you're going to have 7 years of famine. Famine was a real issue. It's a real issue in modern life in parts of Africa and stuff, but it was a tremendous issue back then. Now, Egypt was a little more protected from famine because they had a generous water supply of the Nile, and a lot of the areas of the Middle East were dependent on rainfall. But famine in the Middle East in ancient days was a real issue. So Pharaoh goes, whoa, and he says, well, who's going to help me? So eventually he decides to make Joseph, who's the most capable administrative person, in charge of this. What they have to do is gather up the excess harvest from the 7 fat years and save it, because most people won't save it. And the government needs to save it, put it in storerooms and guard it so you can dispense it out to the people later. So Joseph becomes essentially the chancellor of the Pharaoh, the main administrator. Prime minister is another term you could use. And you think, now, how could this happen? Well, this actually fits a historical context at the time. Ancient Egypt was only conquered by an outside force in the ancient times once, by a group called the Hyksos, about 1720 BC till about 1550 BC. They were Semitic people from over in the Canaan area, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, somewhere in that area. And they arrived, and they had superior weaponry. They had the horse had been domesticated a couple hundred years before, and it had went in Central Asia, and it finally worked its way down into Palestine. So they had domesticated horses. They had chariots, which is like having a tank when your enemy doesn't have a tank. They had a compound bow, a double curved bow. You don't have the traditional bow is bows over like this, but the double curved bow, it bows back. So you have it going this way and then curving back, and you get much more kick to it that way. So you have a longer range, and you hit with harder. It hits with much more impact. So it's it's like having a machine gun when your opponent only has a pop gun. So they had superior weaponry. Some people think that the Hyksos were brought in one of these dynastic quarrels. Egypt had multiple dynasties. One of them overthrows the next one and becomes the 15th versus the 14th or something. That they were brought in as mercenaries in one of these dynastic quarrels, and they just took over. Instead of, why should we help them take over if we can take over ourselves? That's probably what happened. That very similar to what happened to the Incas in South America when the Spanish arrived. They were having a dynastic quarrel, fighting over who was going to be the head of the Incas, and so they wanted the Spanish to take one side or the other. The Spanish thought, we don't need this, let's just take over. So they did. So the Hyksos take over, and they rule for 175 years or so. But they were a Semitic people from Canaan, basically ethnic cousins of the Hebrews. And so it's perfectly understandable that a Hebrew could rise up to a position of administration. And the capital at that time of the Hyksos was in the Nile Delta, on the eastern edge of the Delta. Goshen is what it's called, as opposed to the traditional capital at Thebes, which is way south of Cairo, up the Nile, almost to where the high dam is at Aswan now. So these were essentially a cousin tribe. So you could have these people come in from Palestine and welcome other Canaanite groups to come in there and settle. So Joseph was able to bring his family in. They settled on the land of Goshen. It's kind of amusing. As I looked up Goshen in the U.S., I could find 4 of them. One in Indiana, one here in Ohio, one up in New York State. I can't remember where else. But this is Goshen in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, and they put their capital there, the Hyksos did. If they got thrown out, they could flee back to the land of Canaan across the Sinai. So they have that situation. And then, a few years later, they're overthrown. The Egyptians learned how to use the chariots and the compound bow, and they threw these people out. And suddenly, as the scripture says, there came a king who knew not Joseph. So instead of being compatriots of these hated, oppressive rulers who are now gone, the Hebrews go to the bottom of the heap from the top. And that's what happens in these societies. So instead of being hobnobbing with the Pharaoh, they are now slave labor working in the fields. And it's unclear exactly what happened to them between that time around 1550 and the time of Moses around 1260, 1270. It's not clear, but they probably just were lowly and agricultural slaves, taking care, doing this and doing that, up to tote that barge, lift that bale. So it's a very unpleasant situation for them. And the history stops there until Moses appears. And it's a very interesting story. Moses is in a situation where they're trying to kill off the Hebrew males. They were afraid they were becoming numerous enough to be a threat, which is interesting because if you have slave population, you're always concerned about them rebelling against you. So they were supposed to be killing the male children. His mother hid him in a basket in the river in the bulrushes, and one of the daughters of the Pharaoh, this is probably Ramses II, who had 70 or 80 kids, maybe more than that, and she finds him and adopts him, and he becomes a Hebrew raised in the royal household. He gets an Egyptian name. Moses is an Egyptian name. There's a lot of various pharaohs named with Moses as their last name, Tutmos and Tutmosis and stuff. So it's an Egyptian name. He's raised as an Egyptian. Very interesting, even though he knows he's the Hebrew. So he goes into adulthood, and there's nothing remarkable until there's an incident where he's back visiting the Hebrew people, and he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. Tries to hide the body in the sand. Thinking, I've done this. I got to be careful here because, for murder in those days, they just executed you. They didn't give you trial and all this other stuff. So the next day he's back in there and he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he says, "Hey, don't hit your brother like that." And they say to him, "Well, who are you to tell us what to do? We know you killed the Egyptian. You're going to kill us too." He goes, and he realizes that the story is out, that he's in danger of getting executed, and he better take off before Pharaoh can find out about it. Pharaoh does find out about it, but he's gone at that time. And he flees to Midian. Now, nobody knows where Midian is, and you can find all kinds of debate in the scholarly literature where it is. Traditionally, people look at Mount Sinai in the southern Sinai, way down toward the tip, which is where the historical mountain is. Some people think is there, where the Mount Sinai monastery is. And the reason the monastery is there because there's enough water in those steep valleys that they can actually grow crops and subsist, because the hard rock catches what little rain there is and funnels it like a funnel down into the soft soil in these high mountain valleys, and that's why the St. Catherine's is there. Other people say it was actually over in northwest Saudi Arabia, that maybe there were other extinct volcanoes in that area. Nobody really knows, and you can't tell from the scriptures where it is. So he goes there, and he is at the well, and these women come to water the flock there, and these other shepherds from another tribe are being nasty. Moses drives them away. He's a tough guy, and he's taken in by the family of these women, and welcomed in, and becomes part of their group. And you find various names for his father-in-law. It's Reuel at that time, and then later it's Jethro. Again, with these different sources. Remember, we talked about the three different sources feeding into this account. You get some confusion there. And he settles in. He marries and has a couple children, and settles in, and just going to be a normal Midianite person. And he has this strange encounter with the Lord. He's out with the flock. He sees this bush where there's a fire in the bush, and the bush is not consumed. It's called the burning bush, which is a good description of it. And he goes up to it, and he's told from the bush by this voice, "Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground." Well, getting spoken to by a fire in a bush, that's quite an experience. So he does that. And basically, what do you want? And he says, "I'm the God of your ancestors." It's interesting, we don't even know if they had even remembered, if the Hebrew people even remembered the God of their ancestors after 400 years in captivity. Very well may not and I want you to go back to your people and tell them I'm going to deliver them from slavery and take them to the promised land, which is Canaan. And Moses doesn't want to do this. I mean, that's no surprise. Who would want to do this? You know, he's got a price on it. He's basically an outlaw criminal from Egypt. He's this God with whom he's had no previous relationship, approaches him, tells him, you need to do this for me. He didn't want to do it. He's really reluctant. And so he says, well, who am I going to tell them has sent me? And you get this difficult to understand passage about God's name. Remember that in our era, we don't have a name for God. It's interesting that my Bible that I use is the Jerusalem Bible, and they use Yahweh, the divine name, all the way through the Bible, instead of just God or the Lord or something like that. So he says his name is, which we read now as Yahweh. We don't really know exactly what it said. YHWH are the consonants that they had. And when they first started writing Hebrew 700 or 800 years later, they only used consonants, didn't have any vowels. Excuse me, it's about 300 or 400 years later they started writing Hebrew. And it translates as, I am what I am. Well, an enigmatic answer to an enigmatic question, or I will be what I will be, an enigmatic answer to an enigmatic question. And that's all he'll give him as an answer, because he's got to think, well, okay. And he says, hey, I'm not articulate. I can't talk. I'm not a good speaker. And he says, your brother Aaron will help you. Aaron also is an Egyptian name, apparently. And so he said, okay. And he starts back. Now, this is probably dated to about 1290 BC, because Ramses II had moved the capital again from Thebes way down south, down the Nile, almost to Aswan, back up to the eastern part of the Nile Delta, apparently not because he was worrying to flee into Palestine, but he wanted to extend his empire and to control not only Sinai, which has been traditionally Egyptian controlled forever, but also what's now Israel and Jordan and the West Bank and Syria, that area that was fought over between various Middle Eastern powers for centuries, forever, basically. And he wanted to extend his empire in there and control it, so he needed his capital a little more central to that. Remember, you're only dealing with foot transportation here, very slow communication. So that places it right about 1290 or so that Ramses was building this capital, and that would explain why the demands on the construction work from the Hebrews is so difficult and so demanding. You got to do this, you got to do that. Moses goes back, he meets Aaron, they come up with this thing, and they go to Pharaoh and say, hey, we want to take our people out in the desert for 3 days to have a religious ceremony out in the desert. And Pharaoh says, forget it. You know, I need them here to work, and because you're giving me a hard time, I'm going to give them a harder time. And he instructs his foreman not to provide them with straw for making brick. Now, I've never been familiar with mud brick, but it's used all over the world. It has been used. It still is used in a lot of places. And there's a knowledge base as to how you do it. And you need the right kind of soil, which is often river silt and sand and some clay, and you mix it, put it in a wooden frame, and then you have to have some kind of organic material in it. Straw is the best, often just chopped up fine chaff. Some places they don't have straw, they use animal dung. Boy, that really sounds appealing to me. And then they put it in the frame and then let it dry and make all kinds of structures out of it. And there is a skill set to it, but you have to mix it very carefully. What the organic material does, as it dries, it keeps it more smoothly drying to where it dries in a solid thing. If you don't have straw in it, it cracks and crumbles and falls apart. So it's a real issue. And in Egypt, they use the leftover chaff from the harvest. Well, that's all controlled by the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh was providing the straw at this point prior to this, and he's going to say no, just to be a nasty guy, to let you know, hey, I'm in charge. You're going to give me a hard time. I'm going to give you a hard time right back. So that's where we stop So you got Moses and Pharaoh kind of at loggerheads here. And the next, and we're going to do this in more detail than you think. We're going to plow through this. And next comes the chapters 7 through 13, which is what you should read if you do your reading in advance. These are the plagues. The plagues, there's two different lists. There's an 8-plague list in the old account. There's the 10-plague list in the priestly account, which is a little bit later. It culminates, of course, in the death of the firstborn, conjunction with the Passover festival. This is what really does it. So as you read this, think about what's the importance of the plagues, because the traditional meaning, I'm going to give my lesson for next week away. Now, traditional meaning is that this was to battle with Pharaoh, and that if you may pay attention to what's happened before, the struggle is not between God and the Egyptian gods. They're never mentioned. The struggle is between God and Pharaoh. And the account says that God's in control all the time. He says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. That I will make Pharaoh stubborn. So it's really not a battle between the Yahweh God and the Egyptian gods. It's a battle between Moses and Pharaoh, and God's going to win it in the end when it's his time. What's the point of all these other plagues? Well, I would contend, and you all think about it, that what he's really trying to impress with the plagues are the Hebrews. Because these people have probably lost their faith from Abraham in the 400 years in captivity, being servile. Slaves tend to lose their own religious basis and adapt those of their masters. And they were probably sitting there without any religious thing at all. And this strange guy that they knew from before arrives out of the desert and says, this new God is going to take us out and take us off to the Holy Land. And he's got to be able to convince them of his power also. So it's not just to impress the Pharaoh, it's also to impress the Hebrews. Because if you read the accounts afterwards, you're going to see they were not a brave and forthright group. They're whining and crabbing and fussing the whole way across the Sinai. So we're going to stop here and enjoy your reading. Read about the plagues, Exodus 7 through 13. Talk about the plagues. We'll do that next week. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.